Welcome viewers, I am Dr. Tarang Kapoor and I teach philosophy. We are discussing utilitarianism in this lecture. In the last lecture, we have already discussed the two versions of utilitarianism given by Jeremy Bentham and J.S. Mill. This lecture is going to reflect on act, rule and preference utilitarianism with various criticisms or limitations raised against utilitarianism by J.S. Mill. Act utilitarianism can be defined in the following way. Everyone ought to perform that act which brings about the greatest happiness of the greatest number of individuals to be affected by that act. So, act utilitarianism talks about a particular specific act and about the happiness arising out of that action. Act utilitarianism do not believe in setting up generalized rules for actions. They believe that each situation and each person is different and unique. Each person is required to access the situation they are in so that they can access which act would bring about the greatest amount of good consequences with the least amount of bad consequences. Not just for himself or herself, like egoism, but for everyone involved in that particular situation. There can be no generalized or absolute rules against any event like killing, lying, among various others. On the other hand, rule utilitarianism can be seen in the following way. Rule utilitarianism claims that an action is right if it complies with the right duties, right rules, and a rule is morally right if people following it create the greatest happiness compared to an alternative rule. This kind of utilitarianism combines the ideas that happiness is the only good and that morality is about rules. We have seen that act utilitarianism judges the rightness of an act by its consequences. This leads to the view that morality isn't about following rules, as Kant thought, but about doing whatever in the given situation would create the greatest happiness. In other words, when we look at rule utilitarians, they do not look at the consequences of individual actions, but at the consequences of people following a rule. So, for example, if people generally following the rule don't tell lies, maximizes happiness. It is wrong to tell a lie even when telling a lie would in this situation create more happiness than telling the truth. The explanation is that not having a rule would lead to unfavorable consequences for everyone. This raises an objection. The point of the rules is to bring about the greatest happiness. If there is a situation in which breaking the rule will lead to more happiness than following the rule, then why should we even follow the rule? Rule utilitarians could respond by saying that we should amend the rule to allow the exception in such cases. For example, don't lie should become don't lie unless telling the truth will hurt someone's feelings. However, when we look at life, there are so many moral dilemmas. Life actually throws many complicated situations at us. Whenever a particular action causes more happiness by breaking the rule than by following it, we should do that action. But if we keep amending the rules like this, we will end up with just one rule eventually, that is to maximize the greatest happiness. So, are we not then again turning towards act utilitarianism? Because then we are going to look every action in its particular and specific context. So, then rule utilitarians respond by saying that morality should be understood as a set of rules. Morality needs to provide general guidance, a way of thinking that people can remember and rely on. Since we need rules, the aim of these rules should be to maximize happiness. And so actions are right when they follow a rule that maximizes happiness overall. even when the action itself doesn't maximize happiness in this particular situation. The advantages of this approach over act utilitarianism emerge as we consider issues of utilitarianism. Another version of utilitarianism, which is offered in a contemporary sphere, is preference utilitarianism, which argues that we should not maximize pleasure, but the satisfaction of people's preferences or desires. So it is about the satisfaction of desires and not about maximization of pleasure. Every person has a unique experience of their own satisfaction or satiation of desires. Those actions should be performed which fulfill the most times the personal interest. The source of both morality and ethics is in subjective preferences. It is important to note that utilitarianism says that happiness, not just human happiness, is good. As Singer argues in Animal Liberation for Animal Rights, when he gives this very popular and very relevant argument, I must say, that there is nothing in the theory that gives us a reason to privilege human happiness over the happiness of non-human animals. Just as treating men better than women will lead to sexism, treating humans better than animals when it comes to regarding their happiness will lead us to speciesism. We need to improve on our inherited morality here, since it will allow animals to be treated as tools for making human lives happier. Now, there are several pertinent criticisms of J.S. Mill's utilitarianism. Some of them can be enumerated as per the following order. One of the crucial ones is giving rise to naturalistic fallacy, ethical hedonism being derived from psychological hedonism, committing a fallacy of composition, moral dilemma in case of conflict between two moral principles is unresolvable. Then the whole point raised by Mill about qualitative distinctions and how to navigate and understand these distinctions. Not all satisfactions are good. Concerns of justice can be raised, like those pertaining to rights and liberty. Concern about personal integrity of people. Then the last one about intentions versus consequences when it comes to moral actions. Now, utilitarianism as a doctrine prescribes that it is the consequence or ends of our action that determine whether particular means to them are justified or not. This is different from deontology, where the means or intentions or motives were primary and the consequences were not what a moral action looks for. Now, because utilitarianism gives importance to consequences or ends, this leads to conclusions which are contrary to our common sense morality. But will this not lead to on us to take us up decisions or actions which might treat particular persons or minorities as scapegoats in the name of pushing the larger good for the highest number of people? So we see, and now we come to the first limitation of utilitarianism, namely the one on naturalistic fallacy. So we have already seen in introductory lectures that in ethical theory, when we use the word desirable, it is used in the sense of what ought to be desired. What people actually desire as a proof of what is good is not given a credence when it comes to moral theory. It is our commonsensical knowledge that from the fact that something is desired, it does not imply that it ought to be desired. According to G.E. Moore, we commit the naturalistic fallacy when we derive ought from is, and this derivation does not admit of or can be admitted as any proof. However, when Mill argues that pleasure is desirable because it is desired, he does not offer it as a strict proof, but merely a consideration. In Mill's defense, we must acknowledge that Mill conceded that ultimate principles do not admit of proof. When he argues that pleasure is desirable because it is desired, he does not offer it as a strict proof but as a consideration, which shows that the principle is reasonable. This means that a thing cannot be desired unless it is conceived as pleasant. Uh, Now we come to the next criticism of utilitarian theory, namely Bentham and Mill begin with psychological hedonism. That is, by nature we desire pleasure, making this psychological fact the basis of ethical hedonism, and then arguing that we ought to desire pleasure leaves us with no room for exercising our free conscious choice, and thus this renders ethical hedonism meaningless and unnecessary. If we always already desire pleasure by our nature, then what is the point in telling us that we ought to desire it? Isn't it already assumed in our assertion that we anyway do it all the time? So why do we ever need to even mention it as something which ought to be done? Moral law in the form of command is rendered unnecessary and moral judgments meaningless when we argue in this manner. That is, when we argue from psychological hedonism towards ethical hedonism. Now we look into the third criticism offered against J.S. Mill's utilitarianism. Mill has already and of course committed the fallacy of composition here, which is a logical fallacy, when he asserts that general happiness is a good to the aggregate of all persons. Bernard Williams argues that the theory's assumption that the happiness of different people is comparable and additive is debatable. Many things which people include in the idea of a happy life involve other values like integrity, freedom, spontaneity, among others, and these do not satisfy the requirement of calculations, comparisons, and addition. From each man's pleasure is a good to him, it does not follow that everyone's pleasure is a good for everyone. According to Williams, Bernard Williams, there's another limitation of utilitarianism, that utilitarianism actually fails to take into account the situations where two principles seem to be in conflict with one another. Wherever when we are faced with a moral dilemma, which consequence to give more importance to is not clearly explicable by looking into the thesis of utilitarianism. He concludes that his evaluation of utilitarianism is this, and I quote, "If utilitarianism is true and some fairly plausible empirical propositions are also true, then it is better that people should not believe in utilitarianism. If, on the other hand, it is false, then it is certainly better that people should not believe in it. So either way, it is better that people should not believe in it." Unquote. Now, Mill undermines the basic position of utilitarianism by talking in terms of qualitative distinctions among pleasures, which is not consistent with his basic hedonistic position. It seems that he has to rely on a sense of dignity of human beings, but then this seems to make utilitarianism unsustainable. Sidgwick's attempt to combine some psychological and a priori grounds to establish utilitarianism is also not convincing. According to the principle of utility, we have now come to another limitation, satisfaction being good. According to utility principle, satisfaction is good, but Rawls rightly observes that on all sorts of satisfactions cannot be good. For what we call satisfaction may be even a non-moralistic something which does not fit in the category of morality at all. Satisfaction cannot be good on its own. Why? Because it is dependent on one's reasonable needs for it to be good. Rational satisfaction of desire is good, or a maximizing of satisfaction is good if it is within limits of reason. The maximization of good is a wrong principle. As satisfaction of desires is based on our needs and particular needs have limits. There are other criticisms that act utilitarianism uh, does not respect justice, issues of individual liberty, rights, and fairness. Utilitarianism does not rule out any type of actions as immoral. Suppose, let us look into this one particular example to explicit this point. Suppose a group of children, uh, a group of people who are child abusers, find and torture abandoned children. Only the child suffers pain, no one else knows about their activities. But the abusers derive a great deal of happiness. More happiness is produced by torturing the child. But as per rule utilitarianism, rules requiring fairness and justice will produce greater happiness in the long run. And only looking at this act as one which does not honor the individual liberty, rights, and fairness will not be the right way to understand utilitarianism. We are into making rules which are fair and just and will produce a greater happiness in the long run and not only for the time being. Now, another criticism is that does utilitarianism recognize integrity? Having integrity involves acting according to our own values, sticking to them, especially in the face of temptation or other situations that would make it easier to do something you consider wrong. Imagine George, a chemist who is looking for a job. His joblessness is causing a lot of stress to him and his family. He is unable to feed himself and his family because he has no job. Now he is offered a job in a laboratory that develops some kind of chemical weapons. Now these weapons can also go ahead and be responsible for mass extinction, and anyway the chemical use of weaponry can have its own issues with human rights among others. Should he go ahead and take this job? Because he is jobless, he has to maximize his own happiness. And given the act utilitarian point of view, uh, the happiness has to be maximized given in that particular act. It might not look unethical if George takes up this particular job. Now, a rule utilitarian is going to come to defend this point when he will say that um, we should have a rule that allows people not to follow other rules if they conflict with one's integrity. So if George really thinks that he should not take up the job because this job is leading to mass extinction by the use of chemical weaponry among others, uh, only the urge of getting good consequences or utility out of that job, which is to earn money, should not inspire him enough. So his integrity, remember Mill talks about internal sanctions, that is the voice of our own conscience, as the one of the key factors because of which we do moral action, uh, as being important in our decision making process. So he should actually be evoking his own integrity and not taking up this kind of a profession. Now another question comes, can act utilitarianism recognize the moral value of our own intentions? Whether someone intends to harm us or not makes a big difference to how we respond to their action. Mill responds that intentions are irrelevant to whether an action is right, however, they are relevant to whether a person is good. An intention that tends to produce morally good results or actions, such as intending to harm someone, is itself a bad intention, while intentions to produce happiness are good intentions. This is in contrast with Immanuel Kant's moral law. When Immanuel Kant gives us the moral law, he talks about the motive or intention, namely the goodwill owing to which we do the moral action. That is the prime important uh, factor, and not consequences or the results which are going to follow. So we are not doing an action because it gives us good consequences, rather we are doing the action which is the right action. Now, rule utilitarianism explains the importance of intentions in relation to moral rules. Rules prohibit or require certain types of action, and these differ depending on the intention. For example, whether a killing is murder or manslaughter or accidental death. A rule prohibiting murder is not a rule prohibiting self-defense, even if self-defense may lead to death. So, whether an action complies with a rule or not depends, in at least part, on the individual's intentions in performing the action. Now, there are several attractions of utilitarianism as a doctrine. We have already discussed the limitations, but however, let us look into few attractive points. Like we have already discussed, impartiality and equality being those. Bernard Williams, in his book on utilitarianism for and against, talks about these attractions. So the first attraction is that it talks about utilitarianism talks about non-transcendentalism, and doesn't make any appeal to outside human life for giving providing validity to its theory. William believes that utilitarianism is reasonable as it is non-transcendental and does not appeal to any transcendental or religious realities. And the basic idea of good as happiness is minimally problematic here because it allows moral issues to be settled by a calculation of consequences or actions, and provides a common currency to moral thought, because these calculations are then in the public domain and everybody can actually participate in calculating, and there is a kind of transparency which is maintained. Now, another attractive feature is that the proposed ideals of good and happiness are not problematic because the minimal requirement for being in the moral world is the willingness to consider the wants and the wishes of other people as much as our own. So, in as far as we are equally treating everyone, we are receptive of their happiness. Utilitarianism brings moral issues to the arena where they can be determined by empirical calculations, common currency for moral thoughts such that different concerns and claims acting on different parties can still be cashed out in terms of happiness. Another influence is that utilitarianism becomes a very influential theory even in the modern times. It has had a significant influence on a wide range of policy assessment matters in political democracies. It can be beneficial in assessing healthcare systems, for example. Now, for instance, whichever healthcare system we have to bring for in the policy matter, in the case of a formation of a legal policy, whichever system brings the highest benefit for the highest number of people and the least cost um, is the system we need for our medical practice. So Mill, in a way, was optimistic about the ability of people to reduce suffering and increase their happiness. And in as far as utilitarianism helps us in um, deciding these practically nuanced issues which we face in our day-to-day life, it is a very pragmatic theory at the same time. Now, utilitarianism certainly is more expansive than hedonism, as we just saw by looking into the Mill's version of qualitative utilitarianism. But the choice of happiness over pleasure is given by reason over sensibility. Now, hedonism has, seeks pleasure and pleasure alone. However, if we seek our own pleasure, then it can have a contrary effect on others. For instance, I may postpone my immediate pleasure for long-term pleasure or satisfaction. Here, with reason and freedom of choice, of course, we move from hedonism towards the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, which is the maximization principle in utilitarianism. So, out of freedom of choice, we decide and call for maximum happiness for the maximum number of people, and we are not only wanting happiness in our own self-interest, thinking about our limited aim as egoistic beings. Now, we have already learned the importance of free will, namely freedom of will, in the previous lectures. That is, the idea of rationality and free choice is central to the moral law of Immanuel Kant. It is reason, the universal faculty that pushes man to seek happiness of others as against his own selfish pleasure. So the whole arrival of reason at the forefront uh, pushes us to formulate a more amicable version of utilitarianism, and this is a caveat that despite of being influenced by empiricism as a thesis, utilitarianism can get benefited by acknowledging the idea of rationality and free choice when it comes to making decision about the moral judgments. Now, to enhance their understanding, learners, uh, on utilitarianism, you may explore the contemporary literature through the works of philosophers like R.M. Hare, Peter Singer, Rashtel, Adams, J.J.C. Smart, among others. I would like to give you a few reference material which you can look into for further reading on this topic. This will provide you a critical insight into the reading material available on utilitarianism. So, these are references of some books. To conclude, I will say that we have taken a long route to understand what is consequentialism, how we understand various versions of utilitarianism, namely hedonistic quantitative utilitarianism by Jeremy Bentham, and then qualitative utilitarianism of J.S. Mill, which is universalistic in nature. Then we subsequently went into understanding the differences between act and rule utilitarianism, along with understanding preference utilitarianism. We also touched upon Henry Sidgwick's uh, idea of reason and the presuppositions by benevolence and others in the idea of God, which he takes recourse to give his version of utilitarianism. Then we looked into certain criticisms of J.S. Mill's thesis on utilitarianism, along with certain other criticisms which can be raised against act and rule utilitarianism. With this, we have explored a very important, significant, and popular ethical theory, which is one of the foremost theories when it comes to understand normative ethical theories, namely utilitarianism. Thank you.